Joining us now, Amjad Iraqi. He is the editor at 972 Magazine. On the, video call from Israel. Is that right? Okay, great. Amjad, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
There's really two, major sides of the story here. One you wrote about today. One is the sort of the election results in terms of like the governing coalition, which by all accounts is the most right wing, the most stable, even I think probably in a long time, of Israeli governments. Those two things are, we'll talk about that in a moment. And then simultaneously the fracturing of the Arab-Israeli parties and what's happened on that end. Let's start with the sort of the headline stuff. Will you just walk us through essentially what happened? It is, and I think it's also important for people to understand too that I think most people who have watched Israeli politics, this is not an aberration of some. This has been the natural progression of things that has happened, as far as I can tell, for the past 30 or 40 years. We're at the end of a chapter, as it were, or an era.
Yeah, I think all the things you were just speaking about right now are kind of very much point to what's been going on in the country for well over a decade. So for those who are unfamiliar with the Israeli election process, so we operate by a sort of proportional representation. So the idea is like you cross a certain electoral threshold in order to get a seat in the Knesset. And what we have now is about 3.25%. And so Israeli politics and elections are very much this kind of tug of war about trying to accumulate as many people as possible onto your party and onto your bloc. And that tug of war is very much around like who decides to kind of ally with each other in that coalition. Now, when most people, when they kind of look at the Israeli elections of the past several years, they'll think that there's this really, that everything is very much kind of between sort of right-wing bloc and the center-left bloc. But that's actually not really how Israeli politics is divided. The central question that is dividing most of the parties, if not all the parties, is around whether or not they will ally with Benjamin Netanyahu. And that was certainly the case for a large number of years. And then about a year or a year and a half ago, there was a kind of cobbling together of an anti-Netanyahu alliance. But in reality, most of these parties are actually in the sort of right-wing camp. They actually echo a lot of the same politics and policies that the main Likud party, led by Netanyahu, actually espouse. So in terms of substantive policy, there's not actually that much difference. And they all have a very kind of core consensus, especially when it comes to certain aspects of like how to organize Israeli security, about maintaining the Israeli occupation, especially even economic policies. You don't have that much difference. It's really around the singular individual. And what we're seeing today actually is that not only is that camp still dominating the Israeli political spectrum, but that almost like the natural state of things is for Israeli society to go with a right-wing camp that is really well organized by Netanyahu, who now has a 64-seat bloc as opposed to 56. And part of this tug of war is not just the organizing of this right-wing bloc, which has been increasingly accumulating in power over the years, but like you said, the very fact that there's this breakup of Israeli Zionist left parties like the Labour Party, like Meretz, that was unable to cross the threshold, and as you're mentioning, the Arab parties, which about 2 years ago or 3 years ago were part of a united slate that were actually the third largest group in the Knesset, and then end up dividing, and that division actually weakened that other side of the tug of war. So there's a lot to unpack, but it really is almost like this kind of return after this almost anomaly of this Bennett-Lapid government that was running things for the past year. It's kind of returned back to the right-wing dominance with Bibi at the helm.
But it's a return there, but it seems to me there are two different sort of like differences, two prominent ones, and ones that are going to have a lot of relevance. One is that I don't know how to really express this. the fermentation of the right-wing nature of this government has progressed at an accelerated rate. I mean, I like, for instance, I remember when Avigdor Lieberman was sort of the outlier. Like, people couldn't believe that this guy was in the government. He had like sort of like outwardly racist positions, and was calling for stuff that people just felt was so draconian. And now this guy is like, you know, a centrist within that party, it feels like. So there is an element of this party that is so, I mean, I don't think you would find a lot of people who would argue with the idea that there is an element within this government now that is coming from, the Jewish Strength Party, I guess they call themselves, is fascistic. I mean, I just don't think that's
supremacist.
Supremacists, everything that's involved with this. I mean, I think there's supremacy enough to go around across the board, but like full on, I think just from an academic perspective, fascistic. And that seems to be a difference in terms of like slightly qualitatively. But then the other thing is that there's a stability to this government that Netanyahu has assembled that, to me, hasn't existed in a really long time. Can you speak about the stability part first?
Definitely. Yeah, what you were mentioning, for example, about it's called like the Jewish Power Party, which is part of a larger slate called Religious Zionism, and they become very much the stars of the show precisely because of their sort of almost unvarnished supremacy and fascism for all intents and purposes. And they really have become the kind of one of the most influential groups in this. And there are kind of two ways to understand this, this trend that allows for these increasingly fascistic trends to occur. And like you said, the fact that you now have a much more solidified base on this. So the two levels are, first of all, understanding Netanyahu himself as this kind of gatekeeper that's been around for 12 plus years. And as that gatekeeper, he increasingly opened those gates to increasingly right-wing politicians and parties. So like you said, about a decade ago, Avigdor Lieberman was regarded as the most far-right politician, calling for the transfer of Palestinian citizens inside Israel, along with other policies. And then a few years later, you get someone like Naftali Bennett, who was the previous prime minister now of the Yamina party or Habayit Yehudi party in previous incarnations, and he was regarded as even further right than Lieberman. And then somehow over the past year, he became sort of almost like centrist. And then you end up getting characters like Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is the head of the Jewish Power faction within Religious Zionism, and Smotrich, who heads that particular slate, who are even considered further right. And so Bibi was actually the one who very much allowed this to occur as the person who kept legitimizing gradually, slowly. And now you're getting to this point where someone like Itamar Ben-Gvir is actually regarded as a very legitimate participant in the Israeli political spectrum. So you're very much right on this.
And Ben-Gvir,
now,
I mean, I know a lot of the people, watching and listening to the show are younger than I, but Ben-Gvir is a Kahanist, and Meir Kahan was a right-wing rabbi, ultra-Orthodox, who was shunned. I mean, I think it was in the 80s or the 90s, and this guy was in Knesset because they're, very tight voting block. Basically, I mean, we have some of that in New York State to some degree, but I mean, and he was shunned at that time. This guy Gvir has something like 50 citations or indictments for basically terrorist acts in Israel against Palestinians. He was celebratory around the assassination of Rabin at the time, and making threats about Rabin in the lead up to his assassination, which, really, I think in many respects, to the extent that there was any attempts to sort of like bridge a gap with the Palestinians and make peace, Rabin was probably the last vestige of that inclination, and he was assassinated by a member of one of these ultra-Orthodox Jewish sects. in Israel, and just to give a sense that that guy has now been named, has the portfolio for the internal police, essentially, a department, which is, I mean, it's nuts. I mean, I don't even know. I'm trying to think of like what would be the analogy in this country, and I don't think there is one.
And the historical context on Kahane exactly tells us what's been happening. This kind of leads to the second level of, like, how is it that the Israeli political spectrum responded so differently to Kahane back in the 80s, where they made him as an outcast, even forbade him from running in the Knesset, and there became like designated as a terrorist organization, and so on and so forth, and then exactly how he got here. And there are many potential answers, but one clear one is, at least one that I would want to highlight, is the increasing understanding among Israeli society and the political spectrum that you don't have to hide the inherent supremacism that exists in Israeli political ideology. So, that ideology is Zionism, which obviously has many spectrums from kind of left to the right, but at its core is this demand and this insistence on Jewish privilege, if not Jewish racial domination in the historical land of Palestine here. And back in the 80s, the political spectrum kind of said, like, we're pursuing this goal in many respects, both inside Israel and the occupied territories, but we're kind of playing by a certain decor. We're kind of playing by certain rules, and we're not going to have this kind of outright, very explicit way of expressing this. And this was a constant debate between the right and left for years. And what's been happening over the past 2 decades especially is that Israeli society has grown more and more right-wing, in part because they're learning that they can actually get away with it. So there's a reason why that people are becoming more and more explicit about their supremacism, that they're becoming more and more explicit about this demand to institute apartheid as apartheid. And now that there are even calls by Israeli politicians to actually forcibly expel Palestinian citizens, to forcibly transfer even Palestinian occupied territories. Because, especially for the past 10, 20 years, they're realizing that no matter what they do, no one's actually really going to hold them to account. So why would you need to play polite? Why do you need to kind of go by this sort of decor in order to kind of fulfill what you need? And this is why people like Itamar Ben-Gvir and the Jewish Power Party being able to say, like, let's do away with all these, with all these dances. Let's actually just be straight out. And as we're seeing from the results, that's actually something that really resonates. And even if you don't go as far as Ben-Gvir, keep in mind that groups like Likud, even Yesh Atid, even the National Unity Party, which are kind of regarded as more center-right, still espouse many of the end goals of those policies and still demand this insistence about Jewish superiority and Jewish supremacy in some form or another.
And it resonates because, and we should just reiterate this for any audience that is not, based in Israel or doesn't follow this, because the Palestinians who are being occupied don't have the ability to participate in the democratic process. And so that's why the split of the joint list is so, I think, important to understand, and the role of Mansour Abbas, right, who essentially split up the joint list and sided with the center-right or right-wing faction in Israel. Can you talk about the dissolution of that and what it meant for Palestinian representation more broadly in Israel?
Certainly. So within Israel's sort of state borders or within its citizenry, about 20% are Palestinians who were obviously here before 1948 when the state was established. But since 1948, they've had citizenship and the right to vote, etc. Now, over the decades, this right to vote was still kind of, curved and influenced different ways. And even though we have that citizenship, we're by no means equal. There are numerous laws and policies that have been in place for decades, some of which are even being implemented in the occupied territories, which operated against us. Now, where that has taken us to today is that in the past 2-3 decades, you started having more kind of identifiable Arab political parties. And you have 4 main ones at the moment. One is sort of like a more kind of traditionally kind of communist socialist party. One is kind of regarded like a liberal party. One is an Islamist party, and the other is a nationalist. And up until about 2015, they kind of ran separately, would get between maybe 2 and 4 seats. Now, Avigdor Lieberman was actually one of the ones who pushed to raise the threshold from 2 to 3.25%, which was deliberately designed to kind of weed out these Arab parties if possible. And the response by the Arab parties was to actually join a common slate. There were a lot of pros and cons to this, but what ended up happening was that they created this joint list, which accumulated 13 seats, and at one point, not too long ago, also acquired 15 seats as the third largest kind of grouping or party in the Knesset. Now, the experience of the list is quite telling because, in many ways, it kind of established itself as the only truly pro-equality, anti-occupation camp in Israel. And the irony is that that camp in the Jewish state was led by Palestinians. They were the ones who were demanding kind of unconditional equality for everybody in the state, demanding an unconditional end to the occupation, which was very different from the Zionist left. And so they really established themselves as a very different kind of force. And in the past few election cycles, they even kind of took their step a bit further by recommending Benny Gantz, who's a former army chief, who then entered politics, and they decided to kind of back him as a potential candidate to oust Netanyahu. Now, Benny Gantz himself is a center-right figure and obviously a very militaristic figure who kind of boasted about bombing Gaza back to the Stone Age. But for the joint list, there was a very strategic game to this. It's that if we can sort of force out Netanyahu as this far-right gatekeeper, and try to at least put some leverage on Gantz to create a center-left bloc, then we can kind of have more influence over the government to provide for Palestinian citizens' needs and also address the Palestinian question. Gantz basically dismissed all of that. He couldn't take the idea of being with that kind of political camp. He couldn't take the idea of allying with an Arab party. And the fact that the joint list had almost nothing else to offer after that allowed the Islamist party Ra'am, led by Mansour Abbas, to say, you know what, I'm going to take this a step further. I'm not going to hold myself just to a center-left grouping. And since it's been a part of the Lapid-Bennett coalition, it's actually had a very peculiar kind of experience because it didn't really have a ministry. And ironically enough, it wanted to kind of reduce its Palestinianness in the sense they wanted to focus on the socioeconomic concerns of Palestinian citizens. But what they discovered was that every time there was a major issue that related to Palestinians in the occupied territories especially, Ra'am could not go with the coalition. So they were actually one of the main reasons why it fell apart. There was a law to ban family unification, Palestinian family unification. Ra'am cannot get behind it. There was another law that was about like applying Israeli law to settlements, which is a very standard law, but needs to be renewed, and Ra'am could not bring itself to renew it. When there was escalations on Jerusalem and the Temple Mount earlier in April, I think, Ra'am, also as an Islamist party, said we cannot allow the government to get, to do this in the sanctity of those areas. And so, despite its best efforts, it was constantly pulled back by that Palestinian base and by that Palestinian identity because it couldn't sign on to those kind of policies. But in the end, and that fissure is very much evident now, whereby because Palestinian citizens are caught between understanding that that the Israeli spectrum is increasingly right wing, but there's also no Palestinian national movement to tell them and guide them, where are we going from here? Like, how do we fit into this larger question between the river and the sea? And so this is where you end up having this division with now Ra'am having 5 seats, the communist liberal slate having also 5 seats, and the more nationalist one was not able to get to the threshold.
Amjad, was it your sense that that last coalition government was in many ways purposefully trying to cleave, the Arab Palestinian partner in that coalition, trying to cleave it off on some level by repeatedly pushing those things, or is it just simply that is where the Israeli public and the Israeli body politic is?
Definitely. The idea of divide and conquer strategies has been a very huge constant in terms of the Israeli state's relationship with Palestinian citizens and, of course, Palestinians writ large. And when Mansour Abbas was kind of breaking into this kind of this position to say that I'm actually open to any potential alliance in the government, Netanyahu himself started kind of giving words to also entertain the ideas, like, oh yeah, maybe that this could actually be something. Like, he was actually stoking these divisions, say, like, actually, you might have an opportunity to be part of the political system. There's also a period where Likud was also making a big push for Arab voters inside Israel as well. So this divide and conquer was always very much there. And this goes also to the more Zionist center and the Zionist left, because they weren't really ever pleased with the idea that the Arab political parties are united. For one, they're basically taking away Arab votes, which they would otherwise try to take. But the other was that, as I was mentioning, the joint list set itself apart as, or let's say it kind of became the core challenger of Zionist parties trying to claim that they were the real democratic and liberal camp. Because when push came to shove, there was always some conditions and always some things that they had to curb to curb democracy, or to say that actually we maybe need the occupation right now, if not say like actually we want to keep the system as it is right now. So the joint list always put the Zionist parties in a very uncomfortable situation. And so so the different treatments of these Arab parties, it was almost in the hope that they would kind of begin to break apart, and we're seeing the results quite evident. And it's not just obviously that those divide and conquer strategies, but obviously within the community as well. There are huge debates and discussions and diversity of opinions. But the experience, again, as I said, of like how the joint list tried to act and was then dismissed, and how Mansour Abbas even tried to be a part of it and was essentially kind of put aside, or could not bring himself to really be part of that system, is something that's still being debated in the community.
And just an update on, to the extent that there is a left that still exists from an electoral standpoint in Israel. Like Labor is down almost like about as small of a presence within the Knesset as you can get and still be there now, right?
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, the Zionist sort of left and center left, as we traditionally define it, has been moving rightwards for quite a number of years. So the positions that it might have held even in the 90s is nowhere near what they're espousing a decade ago, or today, certainly. And what you're seeing today is that the parties that traditionally define themselves as genuinely center left, you now have the Labour Party, which has come down to 4 seats. That's the minimum. And Meretz, which was also it's much more left than Labour, but they weren't even able to cross the threshold. And there are a whole host of explanations for this. And again, this is part of that splintering that allowed that broke the center left bloc, or the anti-Netanyahu bloc, in order to allow the right wing to get to pull further in that tug of war. But that complete erasure of a real center-left idea, center-left camp, is very evident. And it's been evident for many years, and it's even clearer now. Most Israelis identify as right-wing. Most Israelis are voting for right-wing parties. Most Israelis, even if you're kind of more secular and more liberal, are actually much more in the center-right sort of camp, like Yesh Atid, led by Yair Lapid. And so we can't think of this as a sort of left and right anymore, almost. It is a battle within an Israeli right, which is the dominant force and the dominant idea of how Israel should be. And the battles are within that right-wing camp, with these very tiny kind of Israeli leftists and, of course, the Arab political parties. That is the situation we're in today.
Do you have stepping back a little bit, and I'm sympathetic to the argument that there was a certain inevitability if you're going to found a country on an ideology like Zionism. I am sympathetic to the argument that there was a certain inevitability, but putting that aside for the moment, from your perspective, what has happened there? Look, we've had in this country, there has always been a significant portion of the country that is, conservative. In this country, largely that is anchored by the evangelical right, and then a broad coalition with capitalist interests, and that has defined the conservative ideology in this country, and the right wing nature of it, and also I'm sympathetic to the argument that we have two sort of like center rightish parties or whatever, but put that aside. But in Israel, it feels to me, having been my whole life essentially been in some way or another been following Israel, that over the course of the past 30 years, there has been a real change in the demographics of the country, and B, commensurate with that, a drift to the right, and in some instances like a full out sprint to the right. From your perspective, if you accept that premise, what have been the factors that have contributed to it, outside of a notion that there was a certain inevitability with the that the ideology would lead there?
I mean, there's definitely, it's not a question of inevitability, but it's definitely a question of, what are the trends that have operated both in Israeli society and politics and also internationally. So the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and struggle has been it's been intricately linked to how the international community how it operates, and especially the United States. What was U.S. policy in Israel-Palestine, and that always interlinks and has an impact, and vice versa, obviously, in how politics and society works here. Now, in terms of the rightward shift, I think it was always happening in some respects, since the Likud party kind of broke into the Israeli spectrum or the Israeli government in 1977 by winning those elections. But the Second Intifada of the early 2000s, I think, really transformed Israeli society from this period where they thought that, at least in their minds, that there's a kind of peace process and maybe we'll give this Palestinian state, even though it was quite skewed in that respect. But the Second Intifada and the violence that unfolded, but not in terms of the Israeli experience of Palestinian violence, and of course, Israeli state violence upon Palestinians, but this idea that we're not gonna buy the international community's ideas of these kind of peace parameters, and we don't trust the Palestinians, anymore. And so we are kind of going back to this kind of self-reliance and might is right, and we're just going to push these boundaries until someone stops us. And the international community, which has always been very much tilted towards the Israeli side on this. This is not a conflict of equal parties. This is a vastly asymmetric conflict, and always tilted to the Israeli side, and then sort of went along by saying, we don't want to kind of pressure the Israelis because we're worried that they're going to shift towards the right. So they actually started going more carrots rather than sticks. And they thought that would actually encourage the Israelis to go back to a peace process and to kind of shift back to center-left bloc. But the exact opposite was actually proven to be the case. The more the international community stepped back and did not kind of hold Israel to account, did not actually challenge the Israelis when they were continually growing settlements, when they were slowly de facto annexing, when under the 12 years of Netanyahu, whereby there was a lot of friction with international governments, including the U.S., Barack Obama had infamous kind of standoffs with Bibi on this front, and still could not bring themselves to take basic policy actions that they would with anyone else, like with annexation vis-a-vis Russia, or any kind of anti-democratic policies by a so-called friend and ally like Israel. And so the more they step back, the more the Israelis realize, oh yeah, we're getting away with this. We can keep pushing the boundaries. It's a very natural kind of socio-political response. And so when you're used to impunity, why would you change course? They're actually saying that my method and the method that the right wing had basically infused into Israeli society was actually proven correct, that we can keep going about this because everything else is basically falling onto our side. So it's a lot of complex factors, definitely, but I think these interplays are really, really crucial. And it's not an issue, and again, Israel is not unique in this respect. Right. You see a lot of these kind of same trends across many countries. It's not exceptional at all. But what is being a little bit exceptional is the extent to which that impunity is so encouraged, especially in the United States, and that there's no kind of even thinking to try to think about a different kind of way of politics and policy to understand that Israel is going down a very far right, if not fascistic trend, and obviously instituting a regime of apartheid and and being very unapologetic about it, and that drastically needs to shift.
For me, what stands out is that in terms of that dynamic and the role that the U.S. played, that during the Bush administration in particular, that dynamic changed. No longer was the U.S. a reason for an Israeli politician to look to their right and go they're holding us back. the U.S. It seemed like the Bush administration was like, not just, I'm not letting you have the keys because you're a little bit drunk, but rather, I just put the keys in the ignition for you, get in the car, and you're good to go. Like, I mean, that they forced the hand, it seemed to me, like they did the opposite. They not only like gave just like carrots, like they were force feeding carrots almost on some level, to use your example. And then the other thing I wonder is, over the course of that same period of time, particularly from like the early 90s into the early aughts, or maybe late into the late aughts, you have an influx of almost 2 million Russian emigres who are brought in. They are in many instances used as facts on the ground to populate the West Bank by the Israeli government, to in addition to sort of an influx of ultra Orthodox coming from the United States to some extent. And, but this is a country of 5 million people at that time, 4 million people. And over the course of the next 20 years, 2 million people who have essentially grown up under what was an authoritarian regime enter into the country. And I feel like that also exacerbated, there's other trends there, but to the extent as an accelerant, that also exacerbates it, because a lot of times they're put in a position of like, here's your land, maybe unaware of like, it wasn't really your land, but once they get it, they're convinced it is. What's your sense of that?
So on the first kind of point about the Bush administration, you're definitely right. And there was, during those early 2000s, it was this big confluence of, first of all, you had Bush in the White House, but also Ariel Sharon as Israeli prime minister, who himself was a very right-wing,
Yep.
very militaristic figure. And so there was this kind of partnership that ultimately emerged.
And it
That
was
was also
his,
the time
we should
of-
remember, like it was his, obviously you know this, but it was his marching on the Temple Mount, or basically on the what is considered one of the most holy mosques for Muslims, marching across there with a bunch of soldiers that in many ways set off. I mean, there was obviously other factors, but it was one of the catalysts for the Intifada.
Yeah, exactly. And that built up both in terms of the Second Intifada, and also, of course, that was the time of 9/11. That was the time of the war on terror. And so you end up getting this, this alignment of these narratives and these wars, both on the Israeli side and the American side, and being able to kind of piece it together. And so those early 2000s, you had the Americans tell the Israelis, go for it. And obviously the Bush administration itself, intervened, massively in the Middle East with the Iraq War, et cetera, et cetera. Like there was this massive macro structure that allowed for the two states to kind of to really go all out. Now, in the later years, I think the Bush administration tried to kind of begin to rectify that a little bit. They also tried to make a few peace pushes. They were still kind of on the two-state agenda. But again, the inherent lopsidedness of who they're allying with, to really just keep giving the Israelis a carte blanche and actually putting more of the burdens on the Palestinians as the weaker party. And all this, of course, is in relation also to the fact that the Palestinian leadership during those early 2000s was also ripped apart. They also were kind of reeling from state violence and the violence that they had also carried out, and they were actually much weaker. And so there was also no Palestinian leadership to also really significantly play a role in that, especially after Arafat's death. So it is always this kind of constant confluence that emerges, and we're dealing with that impact today. Those defining years in 2000s really set the trend for Netanyahu to come to power in 2009 and to keep pushing those boundaries ever since. And again, the question of Russian emigres, I mean, demographics, they obviously have a huge role in the kind of political, cultural influences that they bring. I wouldn't say that they had necessarily like a unique role per se, though, there's definitely a kind of direct correlation in the sense of like Avigdor Lieberman's party, Yisrael Beitenu, which was actually kind of regarded for a long time as the party for most Russian Israelis, which kind of focused a lot on their needs. And, most Russian citizens here, or Russian Israelis, kind of didn't always necessarily care as much about Lieberman's Palestinian kind of policy in that respect. But, it's sort of like you take what you get from these different kinds of parties. But like you said, there are also those who went to the settlements and said, yep, cheap housing, occupation, not occupation. There's also arguments about the idea of like how the kind of the idea of strength in politics kind of infused a bit more into Israeliness, though that's also been very much the case within the state before the massive Russian migration. So I definitely think it played. I would imagine it played a role. But yeah, I think there was just like these larger macro factors that were at play that just allowed it all to kind of reach the point we're at today.
Can you talk and expand on? And I know you've spoken about this earlier in our conversation, but the rise and like not actual fall, but return of the Sith, Benjamin Netanyahu. I'm conflating two Star Wars titles there, but whatever. The fact that, basically he had these corruption investigations into him. He was trying to cling to power for a long time, and he was ousted. But now he's back, and it always kind of seemed inevitable that he was going to come back into power, at least from the outside. But I guess what the domestic response has been in Israel to that Benjamin Netanyahu reprieve, and if some of the kind of shame of the corruption investigations and everything that involved has kind of faded away, and if there's like a genuine yearning for him to return to power.
I mean, the cold fact is that Netanyahu's corruption charges and the trial was never, insofar as the Israeli public was concerned, it wasn't really a major political issue. On the contrary, a lot of people, even if they thought that the corruption charges were quite bad and unbecoming, but the idea that that Netanyahu was still like the best politician for the job, and even if they didn't like him, they still respected him and still thought that he was kind of managing government in a good and efficient way. And so, insofar as most citizens are concerned, it's not really a crucial issue. Where it is a crucial issue is in the right wing's agenda, and one of their core kind of targets, actually, right now is the Israeli judiciary. And so the Israeli right, as I think there's also kind of a lot of right-wing forces in different countries, they keep talking about the Supreme Court as this kind of like this bastion of leftist ideas, and that they're kind of obstructing, more kind of, quote unquote, like democratic means, democratic being like right-wing ideas, and that they keep holding the state back. This is actually not the case. If you can literally take the data to show that the courts, the Supreme Court especially, often just aligns with whatever the government ever wants to do at any given time.
I mean, let alone, sorry to interrupt you, but like what has been in the news recently, where they consistently side with Israelis who are displacing Palestinians in their homes and just taking them and saying, well, if you're a Palestinian, you didn't have a permit for this, so we're siding with the Israelis. Like from the outside, at least, it seems pretty clear how that shakes out.
Exactly. They are really a reliable rubber stamp when it comes to Israel's policies in the occupied territories. And to be honest, also vis-a-vis Palestinian citizens. There are a lot of laws that were passed under Netanyahu's reign, which Palestinian citizens took to the Supreme Court, and the court said, no, we can keep the laws. And they would come up with all these quite, what should I say, bizarre arguments in order to keep them in play, and sometimes even supported the racism of those laws. But the right wing still kind of wants to play this out. They have it on some levels because of this myth that the court is kind of obstructing them. But for Netanyahu, it's a very specific reason that the more that he can infuse political influence over the courts and the judges, that he's hoping that it can play a role in ensuring that he doesn't get charged by the courts. It's ensuring that they kind of espouse his right wing beliefs and his right wing values. And so that's a kind of the weird dissonance, and sort of like that the public is not really that riled up by the question of corruption, but that it is very much in the back, in the forefront of the minds of people like Netanyahu and the far right for other reasons. Amjad,
we're going to be obviously talking more about where Israel goes from here, because obviously the implications of this election are not just a reflection on where the Israeli public is at this point, but it's also, I think, like the actual material differences that are going to start to roll out of a government that is both this far right wing and so stable, seemingly anyways, at this point, that that is a recipe for some, I think, some really horrible legislation and things moving forward, and we're going to have to deal with that on another time. But as far as today, thank you so much, Amjad Iraqi, the editor at 972 Magazine. We'll put a link to 972 Magazine. We read it quite a bit around here. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.